without question, one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. It was one faith trying to exterminate another.
There were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
This religious fanaticism spread to Tudor England, where Catholics and Protestants did their best to wipe each other out. The persecution continued in the 18th century when countless ordinary women were drowned or burned at the stake after they were accused of being witches.
1/3 of the entire population was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the other 2/3.
The Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before them. This was a war of magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war on people that couldn't fight back.
The world lived in the shadow, Inquisition and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson.
Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.
The horrors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the persecution of the Knights Templar, and the arrest and burning at the stake of Joan of Arc. We look at all of these extraordinary stories in this episode of Inquisition.
At the end of the day, these Inquisitions are all about control and wealth. If there's an upsurgent movement, if it's religious, if it's political, they are going to be taken down because they are a threat.
The early years of the 13th century were dominated by two great religious power bases. One was the Holy Roman Empire, which controlled most of Europe. The other was the Islamic Empire, which controlled Arabia, Palestine, and southern Spain. It was a time of conflict and war between the East and the West. The Crusades to take back control of the Holy Lands from the Saracens were well underway. This was an age of boiling religious fervor, and the Holy Roman Empire was determined to rid its lands of anyone who challenged its beliefs or dared to oppose its authority. Those that did were branded as heretics. In the year 1208, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade against a radical sect of Christians based in the Languedoc area of southwest France. They were called the Cathars.
The Cathars were a bunch of way-out Christians who hung out in southwestern France at the end of the 12th century. We're talking around 1180, 1190. And their basic belief is there is a good, true God, but he didn't make the world. To them, the explanation for why the world is so screwed up is it was made by a wrong God, a lesser God, and we are his imperfect creations. So the best thing anybody can want to do is get out of the world and get up to heaven to the true God.
They didn't have a lot of belongings, they didn't own a lot of property, and they went around preaching to people, usually in pairs, and delivering that message. And people responded to that with alacrity because it was, they were approachable, they were accessible, they seemed to be embodying this idea of the early church in a way that the how should we call it, the institutional church, if you like, at that time wasn't doing. So one of the problems that the church had, and one of the reasons that they found these groups alarming, was that they presented a kind of competition.
The biggest difference between Cathars and Rome is that the Cathars had a religious belief system that they were devout to. It wasn't about profit, it wasn't about power, it was about what they believed was the purest way to reach their God.
I believe that Rome attacked the Cathars purely and simply because the Cathars were fed up with the bigotry and the greed and the terror that was being rained upon the world by the Catholic Church. They had slightly different views on religion. They didn't believe in purgatory. They didn't believe in celibacy. They hated killing. And purely and simply, the Catholic Church was starting to lose a little bit of ground, and so they decided the only way to do something about it was to slaughter them, to kill them, which is what they did, in great numbers.
Rome sent a huge army of mainly French soldiers against the Cathars. Its goal was simple: to destroy them completely and to seize their assets. It was the beginning of a brutal 20-year campaign, which was marked by the indiscriminate slaughter of thousands of innocent people. This was ethnic cleansing on a grand scale. Historian Andrew Goff has spent years researching and investigating the persecution of the Cathars and the mercenary army behind it.
It's important to remember that the Inquisition army was not a foreign force. No, they were actually comprised entirely of French troops who belonged to the barons and lords of Catholic northern France. So these northern crusaders would have been happy to come down and beat up on these southern heretics. But let me tell you the real reason for this crusade. The truth is, they wanted to acquire new lands. Their motivation was simple. They wanted to line their own pockets.
Rome's issue with the Cathars is simply that they caused a large, rich, important slice of France to declare independence from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church was getting used to heretics, but they usually hang out in mountain valleys or secret meetings. This is an open rebellion or the secession of a very important bit of territory from the Church. So the Pope and his friends thought about it for a moment and declared war on them.
Le pape claque ses doigts, les armées viennent en marche. J'entends parler des rumeurs qu'on rencontre avec le pape et ses évêques ces jours-ci.
In July 1209, Rome's army arrived outside the hilltop city of Béziers. Its commanders demanded that the city surrender, but the Cathar-sympathizing inhabitants refused. What happened next would go down as one of medieval history's most ruthless and cruel acts. In a single day, almost the entire population of Béziers was slaughtered, and the city was razed to the ground. Contemporary sources estimated the number of dead to be at least 10,000 people. The bloody stain of the massacre at Béziers remains to this very day.
So imagine the scene. 21st of July, 1209. A huge army, some say 30,000 soldiers, amassed in the fields behind me, outside of the city walls. Inside, the 10,000 residents of Béziers are protected by only a couple hundred soldiers of the local lords and barons who are faithful to the Cathars. The bishop fears retaliation. He fears a slaughter. He attempts to negotiate. The inquisitors want him to give up the city's heretics. They give him a list of 222 people accused of heresy, mostly Cathars, but the city refuses to comply. The next day, according to reports, a skirmish breaks out between some of the Inquisition army and the local lightly armed residents of Béziers. This results in the troops storming the city en masse. Carnage is a result. Thousands of men, women, and children are slaughtered. The Cathars would refer to this as a day of butchery.
The sack of Béziers is the first great atrocity of the crusade against the Cathars, and it was utterly shocking because until now, towns change hands, but they're good bits of real estate with useful people inside, so you try not to damage them too much. What happened at Béziers was that the town was treated as though it were a non-human, non-Christian community by fellow Christians. The slaughter was just unchecked, uncontrolled. And there is a famous story that when one of the people in charge actually had scruples about the fact that regular Catholics were getting killed alongside heretics by the Crusaders, somebody else just answered, well, God will look after his own. You kill the wrong people, they're going to go to heaven. Lighten up, don't worry.
About 20 years later, a local historian has this account of the attack. When they discovered from the admissions of some of them that they were Catholics mingled with the heretics, they said to the abbot, "Sir, what shall we do? For we cannot distinguish between the faithful and the heretics." The abbot replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knoweth them that are his."
News of the slaughter at Béziers quickly spread, and as a result, many other Cathar settlements simply surrendered without a fight. It seemed that their will and spirit had been broken. The next major target for the Inquisition army under General de Montfort was Carcassonne, and it was soon besieging that well-fortified city. But the siege didn't last long. Within 2 weeks, it had surrendered without a fight.
Imagine the scene. It's 12:09, the 1st of August, and every man, woman, and child is painfully aware of the fact that the last place these crusaders visited was Carnage. Only this time would be different. De Montfort had a plan. He shut down the food and water supply to the city, and within 2 weeks, there was surrender, forcing every man, woman, and child to exit the city through the gates behind them.
Rome went after the Cathars because they believed in the wrong religion. And to Rome, that's not only an insult, but it diminishes the glory of the true God. If you don't go after these guys, then you're not actually a true Christian. But they enlisted the services of thousands and thousands of greedy, landless, penniless knights and men-at-arms who wanted very much to get rich by plundering Cathar territory. And that's exactly what they did.
After the surrender of mighty Carcassonne, other Cathar towns in the region also quickly fell. Albi, Castel Naudary, Fanjo, all surrendered to Rome's army.
It's not surprising at all that Carcassonne surrendered without any scuffle whatsoever. There was no slaughter, there was no battle. What happened at Béziers sent a loud and clear message throughout the entire region. Renounce your faith or prepare to die.
The Inquisition continued to hunt down the remaining Cathars in the Languedoc region. Eventually, most sought refuge in the remote but imposing hilltop castle at Montségur. It was perched high up in the Midi-Pyrenees. It had good supply lines, and it was virtually impossible to attack.
Basically, the Cathars had been hounded, to say the least, but they got themselves a base in a place called the Chateau de Montségur, and they literally holed up there. It was their last bastion, for want of a better word, and they ran the Cathar church from there, and something like 10,000 troops were actually sent to besiege the chateau.
Montségur is not particularly interesting as a defensive place because it's surrounded by other mountains, so it's only good as a safe place, but it also means that it's incredibly hard to break into. And because it's quite a big mountain, the army was not able to surround it.
There was literally only hundreds there, and of course the Cathars didn't fight, they didn't kill. And there were something like 210 perfecti, as they were called, that were there, and about 100 defenders, 100 fighters. They held out for many, many months, but eventually, of course, 10,000 troops against them. They actually invaded the place, and just before they actually smashed in the walls, they gave in. They were taken out, tried, and all of them were burnt at the stake, burnt alive at the stake.
On March 16th, 1244, the remaining Cathars were led down the mountain into the pyre that was constructed by the Inquisition army. And there, they voluntarily martyred themselves in the flames.
It had taken the best part of 40 years and had claimed upwards of 50,000 lives. But the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars had finally achieved the Church of Rome's goal of clearing out what it saw as southern France's nest of heretics. It had also seized control of huge amounts of land and assets. And just as importantly, the crusade had also been the proving ground for the Church's new Holy Inquisition, which would grow both in power and reach over the coming centuries.
Beating the Cathars gave Rome a sense of how it could deal with heresy. It gave it a structure of investigation, the Inquisition, with pretty near professional interrogators who knew how to hunt down heretics and the kind of questions to ask to get them to confess. And also gave them this fallback position, that if anything went seriously wrong, they could simply declare a crusade against other sorts of Christian, as opposed to non-Christians, which had been the usual target of a crusade hitherto.
The brutal destruction of the Cathars sent shockwaves across Europe. It had proved just how powerful Rome's forces were and how far it would go to destroy what it considered to be heresy. And to Rome, a heretic was simply anyone who dared to oppose it.
The Catholic Church was terrified of anyone who had unorthodox views, which was in their eyes. I mean, anybody that was anything to do with magic, with sorcery, mediumship, science, philosophy, was all not good for the Catholic Church, to be quite honest with you.
In Rome, it was clear that the Holy Inquisition was an efficient way to do away with any challenges to its authority and doctrine. It was also a useful method for getting its hands on vast amounts of land, assets, and wealth. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull setting up a formal tribunal to eradicate heresy altogether. It was to be run by Dominican friars, and it was the beginning of what we now know as the Inquisition.
The Inquisition, as such, is a branch of the church which is staffed by experts, and the experts are Dominican monks. They look a bit creepy to modern eyes because they wear black habits and cowls, and they are trained to be able to detect wrong belief. They're very good at doing it. They're not necessarily nasty people. If you examine the characters, some of them are really quite warm-hearted, but their sacred duty is to rescue Christians from soul-destroying beliefs.
À genoux devant le Rey Christ, vers le bas. Je dis vers le bas.
Tribunal would work by an inquisitor or two inquisitors arriving in a region and announcing a general sermon where he would call all the populace in a town or village to hear him deliver a sermon in which he would announce his intention to carry out an inquisition. He would remind them of his powers, and he would announce a period of grace, during which time people could come to him and tell him about things that they knew about heresy, and in return receive a mitigated sentence for anything they might have done wrong.
Vous avez été accusé du crime d'hérésie et de blasphème. relation avec les démons et de nier la Trinité.
For those who didn't or wouldn't confess their sins, a dreadful fate lay in store. The Inquisition's prisons were bad enough, but it was torture that those accused of heresy really feared. It was an important and awful weapon for the Inquisition, and was liberally used.
Sur les noms. Je donnais les noms. C'est pas Blanchefort. Je sais, c'est pas Blanchefort. Montez. Je veux dire la vérité. La vérité. Je veux la vérité.
Richard Felix is an author and historian who studied torture methods through the ages. Chillingham Castle in England has an impressive collection of some of the most barbarous devices that were used by the Inquisition.
This is the torture chamber of Chillingham Castle. This is a place of terror, pain, anguish, torture, and death. There's well over 500 years' worth of European torture equipment here in this torture chamber. This hideous contraption here is the wheel. The whole idea was to break you on the wheel. They chained you onto this wheel, spread eagle, and then they cut open parts of the body with a knife, and then poured boiling lead into the wounds, just to make you suffer a little more before they broke you. The executioner had a sledgehammer, and he smashed your legs, both of them, in 2 places. And then he smashed your arms, exactly the same, in 2 places, and left you there to die slowly. But if he was a kindly executioner, most of them weren't. Most of them were sadists. But if he was, then he'd smash you in the stomach. And that would probably be the end of you. A quick death.
Je veux les noms. Je veux donner les noms. Ta gueule et me donner les noms. Qui sont? Et les dire, avouez.
Onwards here to the strappado. This was the main implement of torture during the Inquisition. Your hands were tied behind your back. This noose was tied around your arms, and you were then hoisted up onto a beam. Huge weights were then attached to your legs, and they left you there with the weight dragging you down, stretching the arms higher and higher, waiting for you to confess to your heresy. If you didn't confess, then the executioner let you drop, but stopped it before you touched the ground, and of course the jolt would tear sinews and probably dislocate your shoulders. Then you probably would confess.
The records of the Inquisition imprisonment and torture in southern France are available to scholars today. Professor Peter Biller of York University has discovered the story of one particular man who confessed his crimes after he was subjected to the horrors of the rope and pulley.
He confessed in January 1311. There's a summary of his confession, and at the end it's noted that he committed all of these things in the year and a half before he was captured, and he did not wish to confess about these things until he was held in prison et in corda levatus aliquantulum, this is the Latin, and raised in the cord aliquantulum a little bit. So we have here the first in the Inquisition of Languedoc, the first very precise specification of a person and the fact of torture, and also the mode of torture, because this is the mode where someone's hands were tied behind their back, the rope was then thrown over a beam, and they were hauled up, and sometimes weights attached to them.
This is the Iron Maiden. This contraption here, inside, is full of spikes, and they're still here. Now, they were not designed to kill you. They were designed to torture you. Up here, there are spikes that actually pierce the eyes. Down here, there are more spikes that actually pierce the body, but not vital organs. And the whole idea was for it to be slammed shut, and for you to be tortured, and to bleed, and to confess.
Yes. C'est un hérétique. Nous savons qu'il a eu rencontre avec d'autres. Avec Carcassonne. Dans sa tête. Avouez vos péchés, ou vous serez torturé bien pire que ça. Avouez. Il sera sauvegardé. Hein? Non, non.
Second most used bit of equipment, the rack. Basically, you were laid as this poor guy is here, on the rack. Ropes here. Your hands put through them. And then down here, exactly the same. The ropes tied around your feet. And then they would start, very gently at first, to turn the pulleys. You can almost imagine the sinews starting to stretch as you were pulled more and more.
Je veux les noms. Allez à notre tour de rouleau. Silence. Donnez les noms.
I think you have to remember that there were tens of thousands of people who were being accused right, left, and center, and most of them were innocent. I mean, there were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
Not only were the Inquisitors hunting down heretics, they were also keen to seize their written material. They suspected that there were large numbers of secret libraries containing ancient pagan texts and manuscripts, which were considered contrary to church doctrine. In many cases, these libraries were hidden away inside monasteries and castles, as it was only the clergy and the nobility that could actually read and write.
Mostly when the Inquisition hunts books, it hunts them under people's beds or in their cellars and their rafters, hidden in their houses. But also it needs to keep an eye on monasteries, because monasteries are the libraries of the time. Really, they and cathedrals are the only places that have the storage space and the literacy to handle that. And it's a really difficult problem of what you do with a monastery library if you've got heretical books in it. I mean, do you keep them so the right kind of person can inform themselves on what these horrid heretics believed, or do you annihilate them completely so the heresy is gone for good? It's a tough question.
It was bad enough to have heretical thoughts and to be a heretic, but to actually have things written down was, of course, even worse, because it could be passed down from generation to generation. So the Inquisitors were literally hunting down books that had any text in them that was not going along the lines of the Catholic Church. Whole libraries were actually investigated, some closed down, and hundreds of books were burnt.
Inquisitors do go after books, and they know perfectly well that books are forever if they're properly kept. So a heresy can lie concealed in one like an anthrax virus or something like that, and in another 100 years an impressionable person will read the book and the heresy will spring to life again. That's why going after books is rooting out heresy at the base.
With Cathar heresy largely wiped out in southern France, the Inquisition turned its attention to the Knights Templar. The Knights were a mysterious order surrounded by rumors of bizarre rituals, occult practices and peculiar beliefs, a juicy target for Rome. With the help of the French king, the Inquisition accused the Knights Templar of devil worship and of defiling the cross during their secret ceremonies. By the rules of Rome, they were heretics and therefore ripe for destruction.
Knights Templars were targeted by the Inquisition because they'd become too powerful, too mystical, and too wealthy. They were all good Christians. They were good Catholics. Hundreds of them had died in the name of God and of the Catholic Church. They were set up really as crusaders, and then ended up by guarding the roads to Jerusalem. They were doing a good job, but they'd become international bankers. They were terribly wealthy. The King of France owed them a lot of money, and it was all back to greed again. And basically they were targeted, saying that they'd become bad Christians, they were heretics, they were practicing homosexuality, and basically it was purely and simply greed. The King of France and the Catholic Church wanted their money.
We are gathered here one more time, one last time, before we must depart these lands. We will know what we must do. Here we shall swear, as we have done before. First, we will drink of the blood.
The Knights Templar were accused of horrific heresies. I mean, this was a pious order, and the accusations included things like spitting on the cross, worshiping idols, homosexuality. I mean, this was libelous stuff, and it was difficult to refute.
The Knights Templar were accused of all manner of atrocities against the church, including homosexuality, urinating on the cross, inverting the cross, mystical deeds. They were accused of worshipping a deity called Baphomet. They were slightly like the Freemasons in the fact that they had their own secret rituals. And basically this was, to the Inquisitors, heresy on a grand scale.
Oh, praise Baphomet. Praise Baphomet.
The person who takes out the Knights Templar is Philip the Handsome of France, and we can never get inside his head and know why he did it. It's absolutely certain the Templars are underemployed, incredibly rich and politically powerful. So the King of France doesn't have a use for them at all, but he has a wonderful use for all their cash and their lands. We'll never know, however, whether Philip himself really believed the stories he told about the Templars. He claimed to be convinced they worshipped the devil with all sorts of hideous anti-Christian acts. And they were put on trial for that, they were tortured into confession, and the leaders were put to death. So either way, Philip the Handsome doesn't come out looking very handsome. He's either a demented religious bigot who believes in lies which no credible historian has ever endorsed, or he's utterly unscrupulous and framing a bunch of innocent people in order to steal their cash. Either way, it's a horror story.
On Friday the 13th, 1307, the French king, Philip IV, issued orders for all Knights Templar to be arrested and for their properties and assets to be seized. Hundreds of knights were put on trial for heresy. Even the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was eventually dragged out before the public and burned at the stake in the center of Paris.
There's a delicious irony in the fact that Jacques de Molay, as he's being burned at the cross, curses the king and he curses the Pope for the way he was treated, but also the way his entire order was treated. And guess what? Within a year, they're both dead.
With the Templars now out of the way, the Inquisition carried on with its ruthless elimination of heresy throughout France. On On 4th of April 1323, hundreds of heretics were burned alive in the city of Carcassonne, the very place where the Cathars had been besieged more than 100 years before. The original notes of the Inquisitors have survived down through the centuries, and they make for fascinating, if gruesome, reading.
We actually have a contemporary account of one of these burnings here in Carcassonne. The heretics, stripped naked, were smeared on both sides with wax, and they were then fastened to high poles, from the top of which they continued to pour down burning pitch and lard, a spike fastened under the chin, preventing the excruciated victims from turning their heads to either side, so as to escape the liquid fire until their whole bodies were literally clad, encased in flame. A brutal scene, to say the least. You can imagine right here what a spectacle it would have been. And it would have served two purposes. The first, to penalize the victim for their heretical sins. But the second, to send a strong message to the hundreds and thousands of people who would have witnessed the spectacle. This is your fate too, if you are also a heretic.
It's often thought the threat of being burned is enough to get people to confess, but if you confess, you might get burned. Now, it depends where you are. In places with a regular professional inquisition, almost nobody's going to get burned. Instead, they will interrogate you again and again, compare your confessions or your refusals to confess with the statements of witnesses. It's like a court of law, a well-run court of law anywhere in the world. But if you're in a panic situation, in a place that doesn't have the professionals, then they will do anything. They'll threaten to burn you unless you confess, and they'll burn you when you confess. They will make you scream and scream until you're prepared to say anything, and they'll get you to denounce the people you love best in the world.
With most of France now submitted to its will, the Inquisition was to claim one other famous victim. She was Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, who was born a peasant girl in what is now eastern France. Convinced she was blessed with divine guidance, Joan rose to lead the French army to several important victories over the English during the 100 Years' War.
Joan of Arc was a fighting woman, an Amazon, a second Boudica, which of course the English remembered. She was leading the French against us and doing very well. She was having voices from God and visions, dressing in armour like a man, and this was frowned upon. She was obviously a heroine to the French, but hated by the English, and she was known as the French witch. And this is what they used, of course, when they captured her. She was given over by the Burgundians to the English, and they tried her as a heretic and burned her at the stake.
Mark, we brought this court in the eyes of God to answer the charge of heresy. You did take up arms against your rightful king and did appear in public dressed as a man. You also claim to have heard the voices of demons and familiars. You are hereby charged as a heretic. How plead you to these charges?
I do not recognise the authority of this court.
Silence! So there's a sort of irony here that this woman, this heroine, was obviously tried by the English as a heretic, and yet she was getting voices from somewhere, and the English wanted to get rid of her. And so the best way of doing it was to brand her a witch and a heretic and burn her at the stake.
Joan of Arc, by the powers vested in me by this court, I do declare you guilty of the charge of heresy. What say you be to the court?
Do not recognize the authority of this court!
You have been taken away to the place of execution, where you shall be burned at the stake, and your ashes spread on unhallowed ground. Take all right. Come!
After her trial, Joan of Arc was dragged to the stake in the old market in Rouen, where she died slowly in the flames. Her ashes were then unceremoniously dumped into the River Seine. By the end of the 15th century, the Inquisition had ravaged most of France and northern Europe. These were now lands gripped by fear, ruthlessly controlled by the Pope and the Church in Rome, and policed by roving Inquisition tribunals supported by armed troops. Hardly a city or major town escaped a visit from the dreaded Dominicans. But if the heretics had been beaten and largely defeated, they didn't disappear altogether. They simply went underground.
The Albigensian Crusade wasn't really that successful in broad terms. It did a lot to put a dent in heresy because it just killed a lot of people. It also killed a lot of people who weren't heretics, and so it also did a lot to kind of reinforce the Southern identity.
You have to wonder if the Pope and his advisors actually said, you know, this whole crusade, this whole Inquisition, that worked really well in France. And guess what? We have upstarts in Spain. Let's do it again.
And that's exactly what they did. Emboldened by the success of their efforts in France and hungry to track down other heretics, as well as grabbing their lands and wealth, Rome began to cast its eyes further afield, to Spain. What ensued there was one of the darkest chapters of Europe's history. This was the time of the bloody Torquemada.
I really don't think you could underestimate how much the Inquisition and the tribunals affected the mindset of the people in Spain.
After the great success that the Inquisitors had in stamping out the Cathars, the Waldensians, the Albigenses, and of course the Templars, they were looking for new lands, they were looking for new money, and they turned to Spain. And two groups stood out, the Jews and the Muslims, and the Spanish Inquisition started.
By the middle of the 15th century, most of Europe was firmly controlled by Rome. The Crusades had been something of a disaster. After 9 attempts to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims spread over nearly 200 years, the Crusaders had been routed from Jerusalem and other key Muslim strongholds, and forced to flee back across the Mediterranean. As a result, the world was now divided into Christian and Islamic lands. Buoyed by the success of the suppression of the Cathars in France, but smarting from the humiliation in the Holy Land, the Pope and his cardinals began looking for new heretics to pursue, who could be converted or executed, not to mention have their lands, assets and monies confiscated. There was one very obvious target: the Jews. So on the 1st of November 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull ordering a holy inquisition in the Kingdom of Castile in Spain.
The targets were the new Christians, the conversos. These were descendants of people who'd converted to Catholicism from Judaism between 1391 and 1415, around the turn of the 15th century. There had been a series of riots in that time directed at Jews, and many had either migrated to North Africa or had converted to Catholicism. But they lived in urban areas, and they were an unpopular class among the rest of Spanish society. And because of the discord and tensions between the groups, many of them were thought to be still practicing the Jewish religion and therefore to be heretics, because while they were Catholics and had been baptized, they were not actually performing the Catholic rites as they should have been, and they were keeping other practices, Jewish practices, secret. So the Inquisition was founded as a way of seeking out potential heretics, potential converts or heretics, and trying them.
At the end of the day, the Spanish Inquisition, like all the Inquisitions before it, in France, everywhere, these Inquisitions are all about control and wealth. If there's an upsurgent movement, if it's religious, if it's political, they are going to be taken down because they are a threat.
In 1483, Thomas de Torquemada, a Dominican monk, was made the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. He opened tribunals which eventually spread across the whole of Spain. The brutal Torquemada became known as the Hammer of the Heretics.
He was most definitely a sadist. He was a Dominican friar. And to be quite honest with you, the Pope set up the Dominican friars, Dominic being, for want of a better word, the first inquisitor. But these Dominicans wearing black habits were, for want of a better word, the Gestapo, the SS of the Catholic Church. And de Torquemada had well over 2,000 heretics tortured and burnt at the stake for heresy. Here's a guy that hated Jews, hated Muslims, and wanted to return the whole of Spain to the true faith, to Catholicism. And here he was, standing at the stake, or standing in the torture chamber, hearing the bones crunch, listening to the sinews snap, hearing the flesh sizzle, and the screams of those poor unfortunate heretics that were being burnt alive on his sadistic orders.
It was Torquemada who really created the new institution. So he was the one who centralized its powers among the Consejo Suprema, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition. He was the one who instituted its processions through the town, its manifestation of its power. That came from Torquemada. And, of course, he was also the one who legitimized and authorized the most brutal phase of inquisitorial history. So for all those reasons, that's why he's rightly remembered as one of the most brutal people associated with the Inquisition.
Abajo de las rodillas. Abajo de las rodillas. Delante del Cristo. Hacia abajo.
On March the 31st, 1492, based largely on the recommendation of Thomas de Torquemada and the Inquisition Tribunal, King Ferdinand of Spain issued what became known as the Alhambra Decree, an edict which forced more than 40,000 Jews to leave Spain. Under the terms of the decree, if suspects were denounced by 2 or more persons of good nature, they were investigated by an Inquisition tribunal, and the charge was heresy.
The inquisitors typically announced their arrival in town in advance and expected that everyone attend and confess the error of their ways. But those who volunteered and did so readily, especially to minor misdemeanors, and those who pledged allegiance to the Catholic Church, and especially those who ratted on their friends, well, they were let off easy. However, Those who did not readily confess, well, that very fact was used as evidence against them for a much harsher sentence.
Inquisitors would come to town and they would announce an edict of faith. So anybody who had any knowledge of something which was contrary to the faith in their view, the practice of the faith, had to come within 30 days and denounce this to the Inquisitors. The Inquisitors would then amass their evidence, and then they would start interrogating suspects.
They would arrive at a significant town, they would publish the Edict of Faith. So that was the beginning of a process. They would collect all these denunciations, they would start trials, they would detain people, and they would bring these people to the headquarters of the tribunal. So it was systematically done. They would proceed town by town.
The Inquisitors kept incredibly detailed records of everything that they did. All of the interrogations, all of the sentences, all of the penances. Inquisitors had incredible power over the people that were contained within them, which is why you see people trying to get hold of these registers and to destroy them or to sell them back to the heretics, because they represented the source of the Inquisitors' power, really. So even if you'd been up before the Inquisition and they said, have you had any involvement in heresy? And you say, no, nothing to do with me, I've never seen anything, and then you go away. If it later transpires that that was a lie, they then have a record of you being caught in that lie, and you can be subjected to much more serious punishment. So they're a very serious source of power. So the Inquisitors don't really need to be particularly brutal, because people understand that merely the existence of these records is enough to give the Inquisitors power over people. People are willing to come forward and to confess things in order to escape serious punishment.
The Inquisition is amazingly efficient, both in the sense that it's good at detecting people with wrong thoughts and it's good at removing them. But by definition, the dream Spain for the Inquisition is one in which it doesn't have to execute or indeed try anybody, because it's got rid of all the wrong opinions.
What we have to understand with the Inquisition and the fear it created in communities is its scope as an institution. So, you know, the great set pieces, like in, for example, the great film of The Name of the Rose in the book by Umberto Eco, is of these very all-powerful people riding into town and wreaking havoc and people being burnt at the stake. That went on. It went on particularly in the 1480s, 1490s, into the 16th century it went on. And it carried on in a minor key going on through to the 17th and 18th centuries. But what, in a way, was more terrifying for people was the power the Inquisition could have over their daily lives. So if you were tried and penanced by the Inquisition, a frequent punishment was banishment. You would be sent away from your home community for 5 years, 10 years. You couldn't work there. You couldn't have any contact with your family until you would basically be made destitute.
The first wave of persecution in the last decades of the 15th century was one of the most massive and brutal waves in the history of the Inquisition. So it is Torquemada, but all the other inquisitors were involved in all this procedure. I have no doubt that the Inquisition was feared, and there was a clear impact on behavior.
Ustedes serán calados hasta que sus cuerpos se consumen.
As Inquisition fever swept across Spain, Torquemada's tribunals were soon heaving with thousands of cases and thousands of suspects. Fear was the key. Fear that not being an accuser might lead to being one of the accused. In this poisonous atmosphere of mistrust, the Inquisition thrived. Of course, there were many reasons to report someone to the tribunals, some of them rather less than godly. Some began to realize that it was a convenient way to get rid of business rivals, unpopular family members, even husbands, wives, and mistresses.
The important thing to think about accusations, the way that people denounced one another, there are many aspects of this which made it a really remarkable case of legitimizing and, in fact, making gossip into a good thing, a noble thing to do. Of course, we all like gossiping about each other. But we tend to feel a certain amount of reticence, or maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But the Inquisition made it into a noble act. In fact, it was a moral duty. If you'd heard some gossip about your neighbour who might be doing something, you had to go and denounce them. That was your duty, and in fact, you could be brought before the Inquisition if you didn't do it.
The whole era was nonsensical, was crazy. All it was, you know, you wanted the cottage that the old lady still lived in. You owed the baker some money. You didn't like the old woman that lived down the road. You wanted to get rid of your wife. You wanted to get rid of your girlfriend. You wanted to get rid of your husband. And so you would make up some nonsensical stories that they would creep out in the middle of the night, and down at the bottom of the garden would be a hare that suddenly turned into a demonical figure and had sex with them at the bottom of the garden. All manner of absolute nonsense that went on in those days. The whole thing was rubbish, was nonsense, but it gripped this country in a way that it's never been gripped before, and hopefully will never be again.
Everything which happened within the bounds of the tribunal was secret. So an accused person did not know who their accusers were. When they were trying to defend themselves, they had to guess who it might be. So you will find huge lists of all the people who this person says is an enemy of theirs, in the hope that one of them may be the actual accuser. Which gives a sense of the way in which, really, what this legitimization of gossip did was to make those kinds of tension and enmities worse, to accentuate them.
Torture, and the fear of torture, was the real weapon of the Inquisition in Spain. It was the job of the inquisitors to force a confession from those who had been accused. That meant certain death, of course, but many were killed anyway before they'd had a chance to confess. The Inquisition torturers earned themselves fearsome reputations for the number of confessions they achieved, and they were paid accordingly. A star performer could command a tidy sum as he moved around Spain, pulling off thumbnails and snapping the limbs of suspected heretics. The torturers travelled with a gruesome array of instruments, designed to apply ever-increasing levels of pain and punishment. Historian and author Richard Felix has studied the use of torture by the Inquisition and is under no illusion about how persuasive it was.
This is actually a wine press, but people were pressed to death. The sentence was that you be taken back from this courtroom to the deepest dungeon, a room where no light can enter, where you'll be laid naked on the floor, with a cloth around your loins and weights of iron as heavy as you can bear, and heavier to be placed upon your body.
Torture was a threat to obtain confession. We have to keep in mind that all the judicial system after the 13th century, 14th century was based on confession. Inquisition, even the name, the noun Inquisition, reflects this new judicial development of the late Middle Ages. The procedure was organized in the way that at the end they would obtain a confession. The torture was part of these possibilities. It was not enacted all the time, but the threat was there, and so it was an element in the production of confessions.
And of course, one of the favourite forms of torture, fire. Brazier here, branding iron, heated up. You could be branded on any part of the body. One of the favourite things as well was to heat up a metal boot and then put it on someone's foot. Would you recant after that? I think I would. And what about this? This is as bad as it gets. You are actually strapped into this and sat on this chair with these dreadful, huge, rusty nails sticking up.
I think the most resonant form of torture that was used by the Inquisition is probably what was known as the potro. The potro was a form of water torture. You were tied down on a bed which had spikes on it, and then you were bound to it with very tight coils of twine and rope and cloth, which would be tightened with each time that you didn't confess. And then you would be forced water down your throat. And this would happen, the coils would be tightened 6, 7, 8 times. And one of the really sad things about reading Inquisition cases is that it was one of the duties of the scribe to write everything down that was said, to be a loyal and faithful witness to what has happened. And so you will read the cries, the exclamations that people made, their claim that they knew nothing, that they were going to... In fact, they often said, I'm going to commit a terrible sin, I'm going to lie and confess to something that I've never done. And then, as the torture got worse, they would eventually confess.
¿Te vas a convertir?
No. Sé que es un pecador. Lo sé que va a confesar.
¿Verdad? ¿Quién confesará de verdad?
And here on this table, the pièce de résistance of the Inquisitors' torture weapons. Dreadful things. Pincers for pulling out the fingernails and the toenails. Here, for actually attaching it to the skin and pulling until they rip the flesh away. This dreadful piece of equipment was for ripping off the breasts of women. And goodness only knows what these were for, but if you were shown these, would you not confess? Because I certainly would. This, I suppose, goes without saying. There's one on the door over there. I presume that this was put underneath the chin and you were hung on it. And here, the heretic's fork. This was actually put around the neck. It was pushed into the chin here and here, stuck into the sternum, and then tied around the neck. And then you had to recant the words, abjuro, abjuro, but of course, it's easy for me to do it, but when it's actually sticking through your neck into your tongue, I would think it would have been very difficult.
It made little difference how a person's guilt was established. The fate was the same. It was called purification of sin by fire, a rather gentler way of describing being burned at the stake. There were so many trials and convictions across Spain that the Inquisition couldn't keep pace, a situation soon remedied by mass executions known as auto de fe. These were huge set-piece events that took place in large squares in major cities like Madrid, and they lasted a whole day. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would come and watch as the condemned were paraded through the city on their way to meet their deaths. Auto de fe were powerful demonstrations of the Inquisition's authority, which also provided a macabre form of public entertainment. Historian Andrew Goff has made a study of these grisly spectacles and exactly what went on.
Auto de fe literally means act of faith, and it is the final step in the Inquisition process. This was a ritual of public penance of condemned heretics that took place when the tribunals determined their punishment, the most severe of which was execution by burning. The largest auto de fe took place in a square much like this one in Madrid, Spain in 1680, when hundreds of men and women were sent to the flames.
For the ordinary Spanish person, an Inquisition auto de fe is a mixture of a really solemn religious event and a really fun mass event. You do bring the children, you do bring your lunch, you bring your friends, you make a day of it. It's enormously entertaining, and yet it's religiously educational as well, so you score both ways.
Auto de fe were enormous events, particularly by the time you got to the 17th century. Everybody was expected to come. And the stage took over a month to build. Huge numbers of workmen were employed in it. The costs were enormous. And when you look through the inquisitorial records, one of the things which is also very striking is the amount of money spent on wax. And this is because candles. There were huge numbers of candles all around, so an amazing sense of theatre, majesty, but also an intense feeling of a deeply powerful atmosphere, I think. That was the experience which was involved.
It's deliberately theatrical. The condemned are paraded through the town, dressed in costumes with paintings on that emphasize their particular sin. They're then brought up. There's a whole religious business of praying and preaching. Their sense of wrong is made clear to the crowd, and if they are obstinate, as the people being executed usually are, then the crowd is encouraged to understand this person is going to plunge straight through the fire into hell forever. And then they are expertly burned. And this is an era in which people watch bears and dogs and bulls being tortured to death for fun, in which criminals are killed really slowly for routine crimes like theft, murder. So cruelty is part of theatre, and the Inquisition just cashes into this.
The prisoners were taken to a quemadero, or burning place, which was really just a large wooden pyre. Those who were let off, well, they fell to their knees in thanksgiving. But those who were condemned, they were sent straight to the fire, burnt alive, while thousands looked on.
The way in which you could be penanced by the Inquisition was if you confessed. The Inquisition only burnt people at the stake, relaxed them, as it was called, to secular justice, if they were seen to be impenitent, if they did not confess. Confession was part of the process of absolution and actually restarting your life. So there was a huge incentive to confess, even if you'd done nothing.
The auto de fes were the most potent symbols of the horrors of the Holy Inquisition in Spain. And the Dominican tribunals kept detailed records of all the public execution, and exactly who was there, who was sent to the flames, and the numbers involved.
This is an actual eyewitness account of an auto de fe in Madrid in 1500. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the procession began with a company of coal merchants, all armed with pikes and muskets. These people furnishing the wood with which the criminals are burnt. They were followed by Dominicans, before whom a white cross was carried. After these came 12 men and women with ropes around their necks and torches in their hands. Next came 20 more criminals of both sexes who had relapsed thrice into their formal errors and were condemned to the flames. Those who had given some tokens of repentance were to be strangled before they were burnt. But for the rest, having persisted obstinately in their errors,
were to be burnt alive.
To get the Inquisition to put you to death, you really have to work on it by refusing utterly to give up your wrong beliefs. And at the end of that, patiently, professionally, and with infinite goodwill, they'll burn you.
In recent years, a number of historians have reappraised Vatican records and archives. Some have begun to question the established history of the Inquisition and to suggest that time has exaggerated its brutality and the numbers involved. One of these is historian Francisco Bethencourt.
You have, I estimate, 50,000 trials in Portugal, 50,000 trials in Italy, and 200,000 trials in Spain. So we are talking in 3 centuries about 300,000 trials. If you count also with denunciations, you would have at least 5 times that number. In average, people would stay in jail for 1 year while the trials were prepared, while they were interrogated. A minority could be was tortured, but in general, we are talking about long periods of inquiry, long periods of detention. You have an intimidation of population. Population knew all about the Inquisition. It was very visible. So the Inquisition was prosecuting heresy at all levels.
The Inquisition ravaged Spain for hundreds of years before spreading to Portugal and Mexico, and then inevitably moving to the Spanish colonies in the New World. It was only officially abolished in December 1808 by the Emperor Napoleon after his invasion of Spain. By that time, according to the Vatican's own figures, 32,000 people had been executed throughout the country.
Now, in terms of numbers of dead, that is smaller than I think many people have the idea of. So with the Portuguese Inquisition, we're talking around between 1,000 and 2,000. The Spanish Inquisition, numbers are harder to be certain about because many of the early records have been lost. Many of the inquisitorial records of Spain were burned by Napoleon's troops when they invaded Spain in the early 19th century. So the precise numbers are hard to be certain of, but certainly in that early phase, we're certainly talking no less than 10,000. That is a reasonable estimate.
But all was not rosy in the Catholic garden. While the Holy Inquisition was brutalizing Spain, the English King Henry VIII had decided to break with the Church in Rome and establish one of his own, the Church of England. Henry had previously been a devout Catholic, but the Church had been unable to deliver what he wanted most, a divorce from his Catholic queen, Catherine of Aragon, and marriage to his mistress, Anne Boleyn. To the fury of Pope Clement VII, Rome had lost religious control of England.
To the Pope, Henry VIII's withdrawal of allegiance was a catastrophe. I mean, he is the first king in Europe actually to break with Rome and turn to the new style heresies that have become known as Protestantism. And once more, Henry aims to be a better Catholic than the popes. That's a double insult. It turns people who until now had absolutely no problem in being loyal to the King of England and loyal to the Pope as part of the package into having make a really hard choice. And they are executed as traitors. They're not burned like heretics, they're hanged, drawn and quartered, which is pretty humiliating.
Henry's break with Rome and of course marriage to Anne Boleyn was absolutely abhorred by the Catholic world. And you must remember in those days, in the 1530s, most of the world was still Catholic. And what Henry did was beyond anything. Heresy on a grand scale. The fact that he'd appointed himself head of the church, nobody could cope with it. And, of course, to marry Anne Boleyn, to marry twice, and it was too much for everyone. And, of course, she was considered a whore. And even worse, of course, she had a child who was considered to be a bastard. And the Catholic Church really weren't happy at this.
What made it really creepy for English Catholics, people more loyal to the Pope in religion than the King, is that the King is behaving atrociously. He's getting rid of a really popular, effective, dignified, pious wife for this unknown with an amazing temper and really dodgy ideas about religion, who's corrupted or bewitched the King and is hurtling England down exactly the wrong path.
Henry's break with Rome and his violent dissolution of the monasteries forced thousands of Catholics, many of whom were from noble families, to practice their faith in secret. Places known as priest holes in which itinerant Catholic preachers could hide were created in many great houses in England.
England is an exceptionally well-run, devout Catholic country. It's not one of the more risky bits of Catholic Christendom. It's incredibly loyal. So when the King turns against the Pope, he has to do so confusingly, not by saying he's embracing a heresy, but that he's getting rid of the Pope in order to protect Catholicism better than the Pope would do. And that really does screw up people's consciences quite badly. A few of them believe him. Even fewer think that they'd actually like to have a heresy, the Protestant ideas, in place of Catholicism, and Henry is the next best thing. Most people are just so stunned, because nothing like this has ever happened before. They don't know what to do, and so they do nothing.
When King Henry died in 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward succeeded him to reign as Edward VI. But when Edward himself died suddenly in 1553, aged just 15, his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Queen Catherine of Aragon, eventually came to the throne. Queen Mary Tudor was young, angry, and fiercely Catholic. She quickly set about reversing her father's religious reforms and decreed that Roman Catholicism was once again to be the official religion of England. She ruthlessly pursued Church of England dissenters, executing so many of them that she became known as Bloody Mary.
When Henry VIII died, his feeble, weak son, Protestant son, became Edward VI. He only lived a few years, and then, of course, next in line for the throne, a woman, of course, was Mary I, Bloody Mary. She was a Catholic. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who, of course, had been thrown out by Henry. She was absolutely furious. She was a coiled spring that was waiting for something that she never thought would happen. And all of a sudden, she was queen, a Catholic queen in a Protestant country. And she did everything in the 4 years that she reigned to get rid, to exterminate all of these stinking Protestants that had defiled her faith for so many years while her father and brother were on the throne. And she did a very good job.
Mary Tudor has had the adolescence and early womanhood from hell. She is constantly having to reckon with having been the heir to the throne, regarded with all the awe and the reverence and given all the power of that, to being regarded as a bastard, to being regarded as a slightly better bastard than before, to being regarded as an heir to the throne again, to being regarded as the treacherous sister of the reigning boy King Edward, to being stuck out of the succession altogether and declared a rebel, and seizing England by sheer courageous resistance. She is the only Tudor rebel to succeed since the end of the Wars of the Roses and actually seize London. So, what's she like? She's her father's daughter. Henry VIII is a monumental ego, flattening any opposition, driven by the sense that he is totally right, And that's what Mary is like. She's really brave, she's highly intelligent, she's a superb leader, but she is a fanatic. She's the daughter of an unworldly, unrealistic, unbendably brave woman, Catherine of Aragon, and she combines the lot. If she'd lived for 50 years on the throne, we'd be a Catholic nation today. Instead, she lives for 5 years, but in those 5 years, she burns more people alive for their religion than anybody else in English history, and almost more than anybody else in Europe in the same amount of time.
Mary's reign was really a reign of persecution and recrimination. She wanted to get back at all of those Protestants that had caused the Reformation in the first place, had been against her mother, and basically she did everything in her power to get rid of as many Protestants as possible, including Latimer and Ridley, and of course Cranmer, who was nothing less than the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he was the guy, of course, that organised the divorce of Henry and her mother and the wedding of Henry and Anne Boleyn. So Mary hated him, and the poor guy, of course, like so many others, probably 300 Protestant martyrs burnt at the stake under Mary's reign.
The execution of Archbishop Cranmer was a defining moment for Protestants in England. A pious, devout and popular man, many people saw his brutal execution as an act of petty revenge by a petulant young queen. And far from rallying people to her Catholic cause, it hardened public opinion against her. Bloody Queen Mary was feared, but she certainly wasn't popular.
Mary, when she seizes the throne, finds, naturally enough, a church which is staffed with Protestants, and she simply lets most of them go. Those that haven't got married and are willing to convert just become Roman Catholic priests. Those that have got married put away their wives and find parishes elsewhere, or else they just leave the profession. And that leaves a hard core of famous Protestant bishops who are put on show trials as heretics and traitors. And she's after about half a dozen of them. The one she's really going for is the Archbishop of Canterbury, the primate of the Church of England, Thomas Cranmer, because he is the guy who declared her father's marriage to her mother invalid and Mary a bastard. And you can see how much she hates this guy's guts, that she actually gets him to declare himself wrong. He declares publicly that Catholicism is the best religion after all. And what you do then is you put this guy on show and gets him to tell everybody that he's wrong. It's the classic propaganda victory. Mary, insanely, insists he still has to die, thereby shattering all the achievement, because Cranmer, when he's actually tied to the stake and is about to be grilled, declares the truth about Protestantism all over again, burns his own hand in front of him, which had signed the denunciation of his former beliefs, and provides the perfect Protestant martyr. It's a classic own goal.
With Europe still reeling from the Holy Inquisition that had now spread all over Europe and into the New World, the events in England had come as something of a shock. No one had imagined that a monarch would stand up to Rome and ban the Catholic faith. But then Henry was no ordinary monarch. In contrast, Mary Tudor's bloody Catholic backlash was more in keeping with the terror sweeping Europe. But what happened next began an entirely new chapter in the history of England. An inexperienced young girl, Henry's daughter, ascended the throne in dangerous and turbulent times. Her reign became known as the Golden Age, but it was also a time of plotting, treason and treachery. The Elizabethan era was about to begin.
Tudor England was a time of religious turmoil. First we were Catholic, then we were Protestant, then we were Catholic, and again back to Protestant. Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.